You had breakfast this morning. Maybe it was bacon and eggs. You scrolled through your phone past advertisements that didn't feel like advertisements, past news stories that were planted by people you'll never meet, past opinions you believe are your own, but were carefully placed inside your head decades before you were born. You drove past billboards. You watched a product review that was quietly funded by the company being reviewed. You formed an opinion about a political candidate based on a feeling you can't quite explain. And none of this is an accident. Every single one of these moments traces back in some way to one man, a man most people have never heard of, a man who figured out over 100 years ago that the most powerful force on earth isn't money, isn't military strength, isn't political authority. It's the ability to make people want things they never knew they wanted, believe things they were never asked to believe, and behave in ways they think are entirely their own idea. His name was Edward Bernays. He was born in Vienna in 1891. He died in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1995 at the age of 103. And in between, he essentially invented the modern world as we experience it. He is the reason you eat what you eat for breakfast. He is the reason women smoke. He is the reason an elected government in Central America was overthrown. He is the reason corporations don't just sell you products anymore. They sell you identities. And perhaps most disturbingly, he wrote it all down openly, proudly, in plain language, explaining exactly how he did it and why he believed it was not only acceptable, but necessary. He called it the engineering of consent. Others would eventually call it something else: propaganda. Now, to understand Edward Bernays, you first need to understand his family, because his bloodline is the skeleton key to everything he became. Bernays was born in Vienna, the son of Eli Bernays and Anna Freud Bernays. His mother, Anna, was the sister of Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis. And his father, Eli, was the brother of Freud's wife, Martha Bernays. So Edward Bernays was doubly related to Sigmund Freud, his uncle on both sides of the family. This wasn't some distant abstract connection. Freud's ideas about the unconscious mind, about hidden desires, about the irrational forces lurking beneath rational behavior. These ideas were woven into the fabric of Bernays' childhood. They were dinner table conversations. They were letters passed between Vienna and New York. And later, when Bernays grew up and entered the professional world, they became weapons. The Bernays family moved from Vienna to New York City in 1892 when Edward was barely a year old. His father, Eli, worked as a grain exporter at the Manhattan Produce Exchange. It was a comfortable middle-class upbringing. Young Edward attended DeWitt Clinton High School and then went on to Cornell University, where in 1912 he graduated with a degree in agriculture. Agriculture, not psychology, not political science, not marketing, agriculture. He had no interest in farming, though. What fascinated him, even in those early years, was the question of influence. How do you get people to do things? How do you shape what they think, what they feel, what they buy? After graduating from Cornell, Bernays bounced around a few different jobs. He wrote briefly for a journal called The National Nurseryman. He worked at the Produce Exchange alongside his father. He went to Paris for a stint reading grain cables for Louis Dreyfus and Company, but none of it stuck. Then in late 1912, he returned to New York and stumbled into something that would change his life. He became co-editor of two small publications, the Medical Review of Reviews and the Dietetic and Hygienic Gazette. And it was through these obscure medical journals that Bernays got his first real taste of the power of framing. One of his earliest projects involved a controversial French play called Damaged Goods, written by Eugène Brieux. The play dealt with syphilis, a subject that was essentially taboo in polite society. No respectable theater in New York would touch it. But Bernays saw an opening. Instead of promoting the play as entertainment, he reframed it as a public health campaign. He organized a sponsorship committee made up of doctors, clergymen, and prominent citizens. He positioned attendance at the play not as something scandalous, but as something civic-minded, something responsible. And it worked. The play opened to packed houses, and what could have been a public relations nightmare became a triumph. This was the moment Bernays realized something profound. You don't sell people the product, you sell them a version of themselves. You don't change what something is, you change what it means. That insight, forged in the promotion of a play about venereal disease, would go on to reshape the entire 20th century. After this initial success, Bernays moved into theatrical publicity, representing high-profile clients including the legendary Italian tenor Enrico Caruso and the avant-garde ballets russes. He was good at it, but everything was about to change because the world was about to go to war. And war, as Bernays would soon discover, was the greatest classroom for mass persuasion ever built. In 1917, the United States entered the First World War, and President Woodrow Wilson established the Committee on Public Information, also known as the CPI or the Creel Commission, after its chairman, journalist George Creel. The committee's mission was straightforward but enormous in scope. Convince the American public, a public that was deeply skeptical of entering a European conflict, that the war was not just necessary but righteous, that America wasn't fighting for territory or economic advantage but for democracy itself. Wilson's famous phrase, "Make the world safe for democracy," didn't just appear out of thin air. It was manufactured. It was a product. And Edward Bernays, at just 26 years old, was one of the people manufacturing it. Bernays worked alongside journalist Walter Lippmann and publicist Carl Biawar on the committee, and together they deployed an arsenal of persuasion techniques: posters, pamphlets, speeches, newspaper articles, film reels. They whipped up public enthusiasm for the war effort using every mass medium available at the time. The committee sent out thousands of volunteer speakers, known as 4-minute men, who delivered carefully scripted patriotic speeches in movie theaters across the country during the 4-minute intermissions between reels. It was propaganda on an industrial scale, and it worked spectacularly. Public opinion shifted, support for the war surged, and young Edward Bernays stood in the middle of it all, watching, learning, absorbing. When the war ended in 1918, Bernays accompanied the American delegation to the Paris Peace Conference. He saw firsthand how President Wilson was received like a hero in the streets of Paris, how the masses cheered for a leader they'd never met based entirely on messaging they'd consumed through media. And something clicked in Bernays' mind, a revelation that would define his entire career. If propaganda could be used so effectively during wartime to rally an entire nation behind a cause, then surely the same techniques could be applied during peacetime. If you could convince millions of people to die for a slogan, couldn't you convince them to buy a product? Couldn't you convince them to change their habits? Couldn't you, in fact, convince them of almost anything? In 1919, Bernays returned to New York and opened his own public relations firm alongside Doris Fleischman, a journalist and feminist who would become his wife in 1922 and his lifelong business partner. Fleischman was a remarkable figure in her own right. She was one of the first married women in the United States to be issued a passport under her maiden name. She was a member of the Lucy Stone League, which advocated for women keeping their birth names after marriage. She ghostwrote many of Bernays' memos, press releases, and even portions of his books. By all accounts, she was an equal partner in everything the firm produced, though history has largely overlooked her contributions in favor of her more flamboyant husband. Together, Bernays and Fleischman set up shop and immediately began applying wartime propaganda techniques to the peacetime marketplace. But Bernays didn't want to be called a propagandist. The word had already begun to acquire a sour taste in the public mouth. So he invented a new title for himself. He called himself a Counsel on Public Relations. It was a stroke of genius. Public relations. The very phrase sounds benign, almost friendly. It suggests transparency, openness, a relationship between an organization and its public. But what it really meant in Bernays' hands was the systematic, scientific manipulation of public opinion for private gain. Same techniques, same psychology, new name. Now, Bernays didn't just rely on instinct or creativity. He drew directly from the theoretical work of his uncle Sigmund Freud. Freud's central insight was that human beings are not rational creatures. Beneath the surface of our conscious thoughts lies a vast churning ocean of unconscious desires, fears, and impulses. We don't make decisions based on logic. We make them based on feelings we can't articulate, drives we can't control. Bernays took this idea and ran with it. If people are fundamentally irrational, then you can't persuade them with facts and arguments alone. You have to reach them at a deeper level. You have to tap into their unconscious desires and attach your product, your cause, your client to those desires. But Freud wasn't the only intellectual influence. Bernays also drew heavily on the work of Gustave Le Bon, the French social psychologist who wrote The Crowd, a groundbreaking study of mob psychology published in 1895. Le Bon argued that in crowds, individuals lose their capacity for rational thought and become susceptible to emotional contagion, suggestion, and manipulation. Bernays also studied the work of Wilfred Trotter, a British surgeon and social psychologist who developed the concept of the herd instinct, the idea that human beings have a deep primal urge to conform to the behavior of the group. And he studied Walter Lippmann, his former colleague from the CPI, who had written about the concept of stereotypes and how public opinion is shaped not by direct experience, but by mediated images. From all of these thinkers, Bernays assembled his own theory of mass persuasion, a theory he would codify in two enormously influential books. The first was Crystallizing Public Opinion, published in 1923. It was the first book ever written about the practice of public relations, and it essentially created the profession as a discipline. In it, Bernays laid out his philosophy. The Public Relations Counsel, he argued, was not merely a publicist or press agent. He was a social scientist, someone who understood the mechanisms of public thought and could shape them deliberately. The book was groundbreaking, and it attracted the attention of corporations, politicians, and governments around the world. But it was his second book, published 5 years later, that would become his most famous and most controversial work. In 1928, Bernays published Propaganda. The title alone was provocative, but what lay inside was even more so. The very first paragraph is worth understanding closely. Bernays opens by declaring that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of the country. Read that again. He's not hiding anything. He's not apologizing. He's saying plainly and proudly that democracy requires manipulation, that the masses are too irrational and too easily swayed by emotion to govern themselves, that an elite class of opinion makers, people like him, must quietly guide public thought from behind the scenes. He called this invisible government. Others might call it something far less flattering. Throughout Propaganda, Bernays argues that every aspect of public life, from politics to business to culture to education, is shaped by unseen forces. He describes how leaders, both political and commercial, must understand the psychology of the masses in order to lead them effectively. He doesn't see this as sinister. He sees it as necessary. In his worldview, the alternative to manage public opinion is chaos. Without the guiding hand of the public relations expert, the mob would run wild, driven by irrational passions and base instincts. The engineering of consent, as he would later call it, was not a corruption of democracy. It was, in his mind, the very foundation of it. Now let's talk about what Bernays actually did with all this theory, because the campaigns he ran weren't abstract exercises. They were real, they were brilliant, and in many cases, they were devastating. One of his earliest and most celebrated commercial campaigns was for the Beechnut Packing Company, one of America's largest producers of bacon. By the 1920s, the American breakfast had changed. Industrialization meant fewer people were doing hard manual labor, and the enormous calorie-heavy breakfast of the 19th century, full of eggs, bacon, sausage, donuts, pie, and coffee, had given way to lighter fare. Most Americans were eating little more than toast, orange juice, and coffee in the morning. Beechnut's bacon sales were suffering, and they came to Bernays for help. Now, a lesser publicist might have simply run advertisements saying, "Eat more bacon." But Bernays understood that people don't respond to direct commands. They respond to authority and to social proof. So instead of advertising bacon directly, he went to his company's in-house physician and asked a simple question: is a heavy breakfast more beneficial to the human body than a light one? The doctor, unsurprisingly, confirmed that yes, a heavier breakfast was better because the body loses energy overnight and needs replenishment. Bernays then asked this doctor to write to 5,000 physicians across the country, asking them the same question. The overwhelming consensus was the same. Doctors agree a heavy breakfast is healthier. Bernays then took these results to the newspapers. Headlines appeared across the country. Thousands of physicians recommend hearty breakfast for improved health. And of course, what constitutes a hearty breakfast? Bacon and eggs. Bernays never mentioned beechnut by name in any of these press releases. He didn't need to. He had created a public health narrative that naturally led consumers straight to his client's product. Bacon sales soared, and the idea that breakfast is the most important meal of the day, an idea that many people still believe without question, became lodged in the American consciousness. Not because it was necessarily true, but because Edward Bernays put it there. But the bacon campaign was just a warm-up compared to what came next. By the late 1920s, Bernays was working for the American Tobacco Company, run by its aggressive president, George Washington Hill. The tobacco industry had a problem. Women, who represented roughly half the potential market, were largely not smoking. It wasn't that women didn't want to smoke. Many did in private, but a deep social taboo existed against women smoking in public. In some states, it had even been illegal. In 1904, a woman named Jenny Lasher was sentenced to 30 days in jail for smoking in front of her children. In 1908, the New York City Board of Aldermen unanimously passed an ordinance banning women from smoking in public. The stigma was enormous. Smoking was considered unfeminine, immoral, something associated with prostitutes and showgirls. Hill came to Bernays with a blunt demand. How can we get women to smoke on the street? They're smoking indoors, but if they spend half the time outdoors and we can get them to smoke outdoors, we'll nearly double our female market. Bernays didn't respond with an advertising campaign. He responded with a cultural revolution. First, he consulted a psychoanalyst named Abraham Brill, one of Freud's former students and the first person to practice psychoanalysis in the United States. Bernays asked Brill a pointed question. What is the psychological basis for a woman's desire to smoke? Brill's response was telling. Cigarettes, he said, are equated with men. They become in the female mind symbols of male power and authority. For women to smoke openly would therefore represent an act of defiance, a challenge to masculine dominance. Cigarettes, Brill concluded, could become what he called torches of freedom. Bernays seized on that phrase immediately. He didn't need to create a desire. The desire was already there. Women wanted equality, independence, the right to move through public space without restriction. All Bernays had to do was attach that desire to a cigarette. On Easter Sunday, March 31st, 1929, Bernays put his plan into action. He hired a group of about 10 young fashionable women. His own secretary, Bertha Hunt, was the ringleader, posing as a women's rights advocate. Hunt sent telegrams to debutantes across New York, inviting them to participate in what she described as a feminist demonstration. The telegram read, "In the interest of equality of the sexes and to fight another sex taboo, I and other young women will light another torch of freedom by smoking cigarettes while strolling on Fifth Avenue Easter Sunday." The women walked into New York's Easter Parade, one of the most visible public events of the year, attended by thousands and covered by every major newspaper. They strolled past churches, they walked alongside well-dressed families, and they lit their cigarettes. Photographers who had been tipped off in advance by Bernays through intermediaries snapped pictures. Reporters who had been told to expect a feminist protest scribbled notes. The next day, the front page of the New York Times ran a headline that read something like, "Group of girls puff at cigarettes as a gesture of freedom." Not a single newspaper mentioned Bernays. Not one mentioned the American Tobacco Company. Not one mentioned Lucky Strike. The entire event appeared to the public as a spontaneous act of feminist rebellion. It was, in reality, a meticulously orchestrated corporate marketing campaign. In 1923, women consumed roughly 5% of cigarettes sold in the United States. By 1929, that number had already risen to 12%. The trend was already moving. But the Torches of Freedom campaign accelerated it dramatically by transforming the act of smoking from a private vice into a public statement. Within a decade, women smoking in public had become utterly unremarkable in American cities. Lucky Strike's sales exploded, and an entire generation of women were hooked on a product that would eventually kill many of them. Bernays, for his part, never smoked a single cigarette in his life. He even spent years unsuccessfully trying to convince his own wife, Doris, to quit. But Bernays wasn't content with just selling consumer products. He was also willing to sell fear. One of his campaigns for Dixie Cup involved convincing the American public that shared drinking cups, the kind you'd find at water fountains in schools and public buildings, were dangerously unsanitary. He founded a front organization called the Committee for the Study and Promotion of the Sanitary Dispensing of Food and Drink. The name sounded scientific, authoritative, neutral. In reality, it was a Bernays creation, designed to push disposable cups into the market by making reusable cups seem like vectors of disease. It worked. Dixie Cup sales surged. He ran a campaign for ivory soap in which he organized a national soap sculpting competition for children. For a quarter of a century, school children across America carved little statues out of bars of white ivory soap, associating the brand with creativity, childhood innocence, and wholesome fun. Children, Bernays noted with characteristic bluntness, are the enemies of soap. The contest was designed to condition them to enjoy using it. He helped to make green the fashionable color of 1934 by organizing a society green ball in New York, persuading fashion designers and textile manufacturers to feature green in their collections, and sending over 6,500 letters and kits to department stores, fashion editors, and interior decorators. The purpose? To make women across the country want to buy clothes and accessories that happen to match the green packaging of Lucky Strike cigarettes. He spent 6 months and $30,000 on the single campaign. He even helped reshape American politics. In 1924, he organized a pancake breakfast at the White House for President Calvin Coolidge, who had a reputation for being stiff and humorless. Bernays invited vaudeville entertainers, including Al Jolson and the Dolly Sisters, to perform on the White House lawn. Newspapers across the country ran stories about the event, with the New York Times using the headline, "President Nearly Laughs." Coolidge's image softened overnight. Years later, a desperate Herbert Hoover would also come to Bernays for help, just a month before the 1932 presidential election. Bernays understood before almost anyone else that, in the age of mass media, politicians were products, and products could be repackaged. He also taught the first ever university course on public relations at New York University. He published over a dozen books on the subject over his career. He wasn't just practicing public relations, he was codifying it, establishing it as a legitimate discipline with its own theories, methods, and professional standards. He created the infrastructure through which all future manipulation of public opinion would flow. But perhaps the darkest chapter in Bernays' career, the one that most clearly reveals the danger of his methods, involves the Central American nation of Guatemala, and it involves bananas. The United Fruit Company, today known as Chiquita Brands International, was one of the most powerful corporations in the Western Hemisphere during the first half of the 20th century. The company owned vast banana plantations across Central America and the Caribbean. It controlled railroads, ports, and communication systems. In Guatemala specifically, United Fruit owned over 550,000 acres of land, much of it acquired through sweetheart deals with previous dictatorships. The company was so dominant that locals called it El Pulpo, the octopus, because its tentacles seemed to reach into every aspect of national life. United Fruit hired Bernays in the early 1940s, initially just to promote banana consumption in the United States. And promote them he did, linking bananas to good health, placing them in the hands of celebrities, in hotels and prominent locations. He created another front organization, the Middle America Information Bureau, which supplied American journalists and academics with pro-United Fruit information about Central American countries. It was Standard Bernays, manufacturing a favorable environment for his client without the public ever seeing the strings. But then the political situation in Guatemala changed. In 1944, a popular uprising overthrew the 14-year dictatorship of General Jorge Ubico. The country held free elections, and Professor Juan José Arevalo won the presidency with more than 85% of the vote. For the first time, Guatemala had genuine democracy. Workers gained the right to organize and strike. Social reforms began to take root. And in 1951, Arevalo's successor, Colonel Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, took office with even more ambitious plans. Arbenz pushed through an agrarian reform program that redistributed uncultivated land owned by large plantations to poor, landless peasant families. Between 1952 and 1954, his government confiscated and redistributed approximately 1.5 million acres. Agricultural productivity actually increased slightly under the reform. Hundreds of thousands of families, mostly indigenous, received land for the first time. But the largest landowner affected was United Fruit. In 1952, the Guatemalan government seized about 40% of United Fruit's holdings and offered compensation based on the company's own declared tax value of the land. The company was furious. The compensation offered was a fraction of what United Fruit considered the land to be worth. More importantly, the very idea that a small Central American country could challenge the authority of a major American corporation was intolerable. United Fruit turned to Bernays, and Bernays turned to the most powerful weapon in his arsenal: fear. His strategy was devastatingly simple. He would brand Arbenz as a communist. He would convince the American public, the American press, and the American government that Guatemala was falling under Soviet influence, that a communist beachhead was forming just 1,000 miles south of the United States. He would create a narrative so compelling, so urgent, that it would justify any action the U.S. government decided to take. Bernays orchestrated a sophisticated propaganda campaign. He distributed favorable articles and anonymous reports on Guatemala to every member of Congress and to what he called opinion molders across the country. He published a weekly Guatemalan newsletter and sent it to 250 journalists, many of whom used it directly as source material for their own reporting. He formed close relationships with prominent journalists at the New York Times, including reporter Will Listner and columnist Walter Winchell. And in January of 1952, he organized the first of what would be 5 guided tours of Guatemala, in which cohorts of American journalists were flown to the country on United Fruit's dime, shown what the company wanted them to see, and sent home to write stories that reflected United Fruit's narrative. It worked. Newspaper after newspaper ran stories about the communist menace in Guatemala. Politicians, already operating in the atmosphere of intense McCarthyism that pervaded Washington in the early 1950s, needed little convincing. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and his brother CIA Director Allen Dulles both had personal ties to United Fruit. Eisenhower's personal assistant was married to United Fruit's public relations director. The line between corporate interest and national security was not just blurred, it was erased. In June of 1954, the CIA launched Operation PB Success. A tiny military force fronted by exiled Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas invaded Guatemala with CIA backing. The operation relied far more on psychological warfare than actual military power. Anti-communist radio broadcasts flooded the country. Rumors of a massive invading army spread. The Guatemalan military, bribed and demoralized, refused to fight. On June 27, 1954, President Jacobo Arbenz resigned. In a final radio broadcast to the Guatemalan people, he said, "Guatemala is going through a hard trial. A cruel war against Guatemala has been unleashed. The United Fruit Company and U.S. monopolies, together with U.S. ruling circles, are responsible." Castillo Armas took power with full U.S. support. He immediately reversed the land reforms, returned United Fruit's holdings, established concentration camps for political prisoners, and plunged Guatemala into authoritarian rule that would last for decades. What followed was a brutal civil war that lasted 36 years and claimed the lives of an estimated 200,000 people, the vast majority of them indigenous Guatemalans. Bernays, the man whose propaganda had helped set all of this in motion, later wrote about the experience in his autobiography. And in a passage that almost defies belief, he described himself as a casualty of the situation. He had been let go by United Fruit after the coup. He wrote that United Fruit's public relations director sent him a note telling him he was so well off economically that he didn't need the company as a client. It's worth pausing here to absorb the full weight of what happened. A public relations consultant working for a fruit company used the techniques of mass psychological manipulation to help overthrow a democratically elected government, not through violence, not through military force, through words, through stories, through the careful, deliberate construction of a narrative that had almost no basis in reality. Arbenz was not a communist. His land reform was moderate by any standard, but Bernays had done what he always did. He had identified a deep, irrational fear in the American psyche, the fear of communism, and he had attached his client's commercial interests to that fear. He didn't need to make people think, he needed to make them feel. and once they felt, they would accept almost anything. Now, there's another dimension to Bernays' legacy that can't be ignored, and it involves one of history's most notorious regimes. In 1933, Bernays hosted a dinner at his home in New York. Among his guests was Karl von Wiegen, a foreign correspondent for the Hearst newspapers who had just returned from Germany. Von Wiegen told the dinner party about Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's newly appointed minister of propaganda, and about his plans to consolidate Nazi power. Goebbels, von Wiegen reported, had shown him his propaganda library, and among the most prominent titles on the shelf was Bernays' own book, Crystallizing Public Opinion. Goebbels was using it as a basis for his campaigns against the Jewish people of Germany. Bernays was Jewish. This news by his own account shocked him, but his response is telling. He wrote in his 1965 autobiography, "This shocked me, but I knew any human activity can be used for social purposes or misused for antisocial ones." That's it. That was his entire reflection. No reckoning with the implications of his work, no examination of whether tools of mass manipulation, once released into the world, could ever truly be controlled. Just a calm clinical observation that his methods were neutral instruments capable of being used for good or evil. And that, ultimately, is the most disturbing thing about Edward Bernays. Not any single campaign, not any single product he sold or government he helped topple. It's the philosophy underneath all of it, the belief that the masses are inherently irrational, that they need to be managed by an elite class of opinion engineers, and that the tools of manipulation are morally neutral, mere instruments to be judged only by the intentions of the person wielding them. It's a philosophy that sounds reasonable on the surface, but that in practice has been used to justify everything from selling cigarettes to children to overthrowing democracies. In 1955, Bernays published another book, The Engineering of Consent, doubling down on the same ideas he'd been promoting for 3 decades. He argued that the engineering of consent is the very essence of the democratic process, that it was not only legitimate, but essential for skilled practitioners to shape public opinion in ways the public never perceived. His critics were not kind. United States Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, in a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt, described Bernays and fellow publicist Ivy Lee as professional poisoners of the public mind, exploiters of foolishness, fanaticism, and self-interest. The BBC documentary, The Century of the Self, directed by Adam Curtis in 2002, portrayed Bernays as fundamentally undemocratic. Articles and journals of opinion depicted him as a young Machiavelli of our time, and yet Bernays' influence only grew. By the time of his death in 1995, his methods had become so deeply embedded in the fabric of commercial, political, and cultural life that they were essentially invisible. That was the point. The best propaganda is the kind you don't notice. The most effective manipulation is the kind that feels like free will. Life magazine named Bernays one of the 100 most influential Americans of the 20th century. Larry Tye, who wrote the definitive biography of Bernays, titled it The Father of Spin, and the BBC documentary, The Century of the Self, argued persuasively that Bernays was the single most important figure in the development of modern consumer culture. Not the most famous, not the most powerful, the most important. Because he created the invisible architecture within which all the famous and powerful people operated. Think about what the world looked like before Bernays. Advertising in the early 20th century was crude and direct. Companies told you what their product did and how much it cost. They appealed to your reason. Buy this soap because it cleans better. Buy this car because it goes faster. The assumption was that consumers were rational actors who made decisions based on information. Bernays destroyed that assumption. He proved again and again that people don't buy products because of what those products do. They buy them because of what those products mean. A cigarette isn't a nicotine delivery system. It's a torch of freedom. Bacon isn't a breakfast food. It's a doctor-recommended health choice. A banana isn't a tropical fruit. It's an all-American symbol of modern nutrition. In every case, the product itself was secondary. What mattered was the story wrapped around it. This was Bernays' true innovation. He didn't invent advertising. He didn't invent propaganda. He invented the integration of the two, the fusion of psychological insight with commercial and political strategy that transforms selling from an act of persuasion into an act of identity construction. He taught corporations not just to sell you things, but to sell you a version of yourself. And he taught governments not just to inform their citizens, but to manufacture the emotional conditions under which their citizens would consent to anything. Now, Bernays lived to be 103 years old. In his later decades, he semi-retired from active practice and spent time in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where his two daughters lived. His wife, Doris Fleischman, his partner in everything, died in 1980 after a stroke. After her death, Bernays continued to give interviews, write, and advocate for the professionalization and, interestingly, the licensing of public relations practitioners. He believed that without licensing, anyone could call themselves a public relations expert, and the field would be corrupted by charlatans. The irony of the father of spin arguing for quality control in the manipulation industry is almost too rich. He remained vigorous and sharp-minded well into his 90s, still giving lectures and accepting visitors at his Cambridge home. A photograph from December 1994, just 3 months before his death, shows him at home at 103, still engaged, still thinking about the future of public relations. But here's the thing that really matters about Bernays. His legacy isn't in the past, it's in the present. It's in the air you breathe, every political campaign you've ever watched, every pharmaceutical commercial that tells you to ask your doctor, every influencer who casually mentions a product while pretending they're just sharing their life, every think tank that publishes a study that just happens to support the interests of its corporate funders, every news story that was planted by a public relations firm, every social media algorithm that shows you content designed not to inform you, but to provoke an emotional reaction that keeps you scrolling. All of it, every bit of it, is downstream from Edward Bernays. The tools have evolved, obviously. Bernays worked with newspapers, radio, and live events. Today, the engineering of consent operates through social media platforms, targeted advertising, data analytics, algorithmic amplification, and artificial intelligence. The scale is orders of magnitude larger. The precision is infinitely finer. But the underlying philosophy is exactly the same. People are irrational. Their desires can be mapped, measured, and manipulated. The masses cannot govern themselves. An invisible elite, whether they work in corporate boardrooms or Silicon Valley startups or government intelligence agencies, must guide public thought from behind the curtain. Bernays would recognize the modern world immediately. He would understand Instagram influencers. He would understand viral marketing. He would understand astroturfing, the practice of creating fake grassroots movements to simulate public demand for corporate or political objectives. He invented astroturfing. The Torches of Freedom campaign was one of history's first documented examples of it. He would understand native advertising, the embedding of commercial messages within editorial content so seamlessly that the audience can't tell the difference. He invented that too. He would understand the manufacture of expert consensus, the strategy of getting doctors, scientists, or academics to lend their authority to a commercial message. He perfected that technique with the Bacon campaign in the 1920s. What Bernays might not have anticipated is how thoroughly his methods would be democratized. In his day, the engineering of consent was an elite craft practiced by a small number of highly trained professionals on behalf of large corporations and governments. Today, anyone with a smartphone and a social media account can engage in public opinion manipulation. The tools that once required a Bernays to wield are now available to teenagers, terrorists, foreign intelligence agencies, and algorithm-driven bot networks. The invisible government he celebrated has become not just invisible, but diffuse, fragmented, and in many ways ungovernable. And this brings us to the central moral question of Bernays' legacy. Was he right? Is the engineering of consent a necessary feature of democracy as he claimed? Or is it a fundamental corruption of democracy, a mechanism by which the powerful maintain their control over the powerless by exploiting the very irrationality that Bernays insisted made self-governance impossible? The truth, as with most uncomfortable questions, probably lies somewhere in between. Bernays wasn't entirely wrong about human irrationality. The science of behavioral psychology and neuroscience has confirmed many of the insights he drew from Freud, Le Bon, and Trotter. People are, in fact, deeply susceptible to emotional manipulation, herd behavior, and unconscious bias. That's not a conspiracy theory. It's a scientific fact. But the conclusion Bernays drew from that fact, that an elite class should therefore manage public opinion for the public's own good, is where his philosophy becomes dangerous. Because the question it never answers is, who watches the engineers? Who decides what the public should want? Who determines whether a particular act of manipulation serves the public interest or merely the interest of the person paying the manipulator's fee? Bernays worked for tobacco companies, banana monopolies, authoritarian governments, and consumer product firms. He treated them all the same. He applied the same techniques with the same professional detachment, regardless of whether the outcome was a woman picking up a cigarette or a democracy being demolished. And that's the legacy, not a set of tools, though he gave us those too. The legacy is a worldview, the belief that the masses must be managed, that consent can be manufactured, that reality itself is a product to be designed and sold. Edward Bernays didn't just change what people buy, he changed what people are. He reduced citizens to consumers. He reduced public discourse to marketing. He reduced democracy to a brand. He died on March the 9th, 1995, at 103 years old in Cambridge, Massachusetts. His obituary in the New York Times called him the father of public relations, but that title is far too gentle. He was something much larger and much more unsettling than that. He was the architect of the invisible world we all live in, the one where every choice you make has been quietly shaped by forces you can't see, designed by people you've never met to serve interests you'll never fully understand. And the most chilling part? He told us exactly what he was doing. He wrote it down in plain language. He published it for anyone to read, and we read it and we forgot, and the machine he built just kept running. If this story changed the way you look at the invisible forces shaping your daily choices, please subscribe and like the channel. We are uncovering the hidden history and the psychological blueprints that they tried to keep in the shadows. Join us as we explore the systems of power. The next deep dive into the secrets of our world will be opening soon.